Hello and welcome to the Politically Speaking podcast. I'm your temporary host, Jason Rosenbaum. Chris McDaniel is doing newscasts today. Joining me in studio is
Joe Mannies.
And the pride of St. James, Missouri,
Jack Cardetti.
We are continuing on our epic series of looking at some of the behind-the-scenes players in Missouri politics, and it's really an honor for you to be here because I don't know if anybody knows this, but we are both on the 30 under 30 list in the Columbia Missourian, believe in 2007. So this is a magical moment here.
I think Chase Daniel may have trumped us on that list, though.
I feel like I'm more successful than him at this point.
Yeah, many of us, I know Jack from the old days. I mean, Jack is one of the younger consultants around when he was the spokesman for the Missouri Democratic Party, which is, almost 10 years ago?
Sure.
And I also remember you from the old days because you and Paul Sloka used to get into it all the time. And now not so much anymore. You're in different parts
Paul
of your life.
Sloka is now spokesman for Blaine Luetkemeyer.
So, but before we get into a nostalgia fest, tell us a little bit about your humble beginnings in the Phelps County metropolis of St. James, Missouri. Is it in Phelps County?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't actually grow up in a real political family. My parents, dad owned a small business. My mom's a nurse. They certainly voted every election and took me into the ballot box with them. But we weren't around politics all that much. I really some of my first experiences, I would always go to the local coffee shop with my grandpa. And inevitably, everyone would sit around the table and they would talk about the weather. They'd talk about farming. And then, politics would come up. And it was out of that experience I got a real appreciation for people that it wasn't always the people that yelled the loudest or were the most partisan, but the people that really could make good salient points about politics and government that sort of caught my attention, and it's sort of been an interest ever since.
That's really interesting. Were your parents active in a particular political party? Were the independents or?
No, like most Missourians, they're classic ticket splitters.
Okay.
I can remember going into the polls with my dad where he would vote for Kit Bond on one line, and then he would vote for the pride of Phelps County, Mel Carnahan, on another.
Right. Because Phelps County, I guess, it's represented by Republicans in both the Senate and the House now, but it does have kind of a Democratic history with Mel Carnahan. And even pretty recently, Frank Barnett's represented in the Senate. So it has a Democratic underlying. Basically.
Yeah, it's a classic sort of southern Missouri county where to this day the presiding commissioner and several of the courthouse elected officials are Democrats. But on federal issues, they've tended to go a little bit more Republican. But we see that the exact opposite happening in places like St. Louis County. I mean, Joe, you'll remember it wasn't that long ago where basically whoever won St. Louis County in a statewide race would probably win the election. Nowadays, Democrats take tens of thousands of vote margins out of St. Louis County. So the demographics are shifting in Missouri, but they're shifting in both directions.
Now, okay, so you grew up. How'd you get involved in this? I mean, how'd you get started? Because you were one of the younger spokesmen that I dealt with 10 years ago.
Absolutely. So I went to college at the University of Missouri. I moved to Columbia, and I've never left, actually. My wife and 3 kids, we still live there. And then I applied for a job as the lowest low man on the totem pole at the Attorney General's office, in his press office.
Now, who was the Attorney General at the time? Nixon?
Then Attorney General Jay Nixon.
Okay.
Mary Still was the communications director. I worked for there for 2 years and then went and became Governor Holden's press secretary. Governor Holden lost in the primary. My wife and I went to New Orleans for a couple days.
In 2004.
And the phone rang. This is back when we had landlines. And when I got back from New Orleans, the phone rang, and it was Claire McCaskill on the other line. And Claire said, hey, you can go back to the governor's office. No one will, for the next 6 months, no one will begrudge you. Or you can start tomorrow at the Missouri Democratic Party as the communications director.
Yeah, and the rest is history because you were the communications director from 2004?
Yeah, the very end of the 2004 cycle.
To 2008.
To 2008 when Governor Nixon was elected.
Now,
Absolutely.
Let's kind of talk about your tenure as a spokesperson because I think this was a time when the political parties may have been a little bit more powerful than they are now because I guess a lot more money went to them as opposed to individual candidates.
Part was because of campaign donation limits, because the candidates can only get so much, so donors would often could give larger amounts to the state parties, so they did.
And my point is, you were often the point man. I mean, I called you a bunch. Joe probably called you even more to respond to basically every issue. And during your tenure, Matt Blunt was governor, so you were probably attacking him left and right, essentially.
Yeah, there was a period, in the early 2000s where the political parties in Missouri were the sort of the center of political gravity in the state. And partly, Joe's absolutely right, is it focused on, that's when there were strict campaign contribution limits, which meant that the party apparatus, the party organizing tools, as well as their ability to take soft money, was a big factor. And so a lot of the organizing, both on the political side but also on the message side, was coordinated directly through the party. And it was really a great time to be at the party. I can remember. And it just shows you in Missouri how quickly election cycles take. I remember the 2004 election, how down Democrats were after Matt Blunt won that election. And then you fast forward 2 years later, and Claire's victory in the U.S. Senate race really was a turning point for Democrats here in the state.
And that also, from a state legislative level, Wes Schumeyer won, Frank Barnett's won. I think there were some other senators and House members that won. That was a up year for Democrats across the board.
06 both the statewide Democrats won, but we actually gained seats in both the House and the Senate for the first time in I think 20 years.
Now fast forward to 2008. Then by the end of 2008, donation limits are out the window, and then of course there's 2009, and Nixon is sworn in as governor, but. Did the parties see like just a sudden plummet in income, or kind of what happened? Because the party's role now is so much smaller than it was then. As I said, I think it was because of donation limits, but I just wondered if the change took place like overnight or if it was more gradual.
It was pretty sudden. Once state candidates, it's still different on the federal level, but once state candidates were able to take in an unlimited amount of contributions, it fundamentally changed the role of the party. There's always going to be a communication role of the party. There's always going to be sort of an organizing role, especially in federal races. But it did happen, and it happened fairly quickly because, after all, candidates want to control as much money as they can, and frankly, donors want as much credit as that they can possibly get. So that dynamic did take place very quickly.
So you moved then to private.
No, you skipped over in a very important part of his career.
All right, sorry.
In 2008, 2009, you became communications director for Jay Nixon.
Yeah.
For a couple of years.
Yeah, I was skipping over that.
So the governor offered, and we had sort of had an arrangement where I would come in for the very initial year or so of his term as governor. I ended up staying a year and a half, covering the first two legislative sessions, and really, being the spokesman or communications director for the governor is frankly, it's the best job in Missouri. It's a stressful job, it's a humbling job, but it's a great job. Just being able to take really complex governmental issues and sort of being the voice not only for the specific governor but for the state, it's really humbling, and it's a sort of role in a position I'll never forget.
Yeah, I was
glad to do it.
I was kind of thinking about this earlier. I think from 2009 to 2010, while there certainly were battles in the legislature over stimulus money of all things,
yes,
it seems like the battles between the legislature and the governor were kind of less pronounced back then. You had people like Charlie Shields and Ron Richard, who I think are a little bit more pragmatic and less partisan, who were in charge. And it was before the Tea Party wave of 2010 when the legislative complexion changed. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was all sunshine and lollipops between the GOP-controlled legislature and the governor's office. But it does seem like when you were communications director, it was a different tenor and tone between the two. Is that fair, or am I wrong there?
No, I think so. I think that in that time, what you had is a governor and a legislature that had some of the same priorities, mostly out of necessity. Obviously, it was the Great Recession, and jobs and the economy were really front and center. They maybe had different approaches on how they wanted to go about building a better economy, but you really had a lot of common interest there. Look at that summer of 2010 when people were yelling bailout at the top of the auto bailouts at the top of at their lungs. The Governor Nixon brought people together and were able to, in a special session, get the Ford deal done. That not only has helped Ford on the western side of the state, it's been a great help to GM here and helped us. And that's one of the examples.
And pensions. Illinois would be salivating over getting pensions done that early. I know that was a little more controversial, but that was a big deal, I would say.
Changing the state pension plan slightly.
Yeah. And the big deal is when you make a big reform like that, and that was a big reform, pension, you can do it on the front end when you see a problem coming, and you probably have more flexibility than if you try to handle something when there's already a catastrophe in front of you. And I think that's some states like Illinois are facing that now. I think the governor and others had a good vision that let's do this, let's do it in a way that's fair to workers, but let's really get our arms around the problem before it's out of control.
What was your most challenging episode of being communications director?
I think it's just the daily. I think it's the day-to-day legislative session. I mean, what reporters, not to knock the two fine reporters on here today, though, but reporters naturally want to write about contention. They want the new political news gathering is set up to say one side says this or does this, the other side does that. And one of the frustrating things, and one of the things you have to work hard on, is to point out, that there's a lot of shared vision and priorities, and that people are for the most part, working hand in hand. So that's a constant problem when you're in the governor's office, especially when you do have a divided state government.
Now, you were telling me before we went on the air about a key difference, though, between when you were, this is how things have changed so much, when you were the communications director and now, because of what the news cycle is?
Yeah.
You were talking about that, and because of how it's changed everything. Talk a little bit about
when
that.
I started as a spokesman in the Attorney General's office years and years ago, and even in the governor's office the first time under Holden, you really were working towards a 24-hour news cycle. Everything you did all day long was really to try to influence and try to show what was on the 10 o'clock news that night and then what was in the newspaper the next morning. And you basically, what was on the news that night, what was in the paper the next morning, would dictate whether you won or lost the day. Now, there is literally a news cycle every 5 minutes, with Twitter, with social media, with, sort of these internet-based news sites. That 24-hour news cycle isn't there anymore. And that really means that things are a lot faster, that people want information a lot quicker, and there's a little less time to get in depth about actual issues.
Now, let's kind of even go back to time like 2006 or 7 when I was starting out as a professional journalist and Joe was the head of the Political Fix blog. The main dissemination vehicle for electronic news were blogs, essentially, which allowed you to go relatively in depth. You could write as much as you wanted there. I remember on the now defunct CDT Politics blog writing 10 or 12 posts a day and going crazy. And now with Twitter, it's gotten much shorter, a lot more concise. We're talking 140 characters. And people are tweeting like every 2 seconds, basically. So
yeah, or like you'll direct it to your site. I'll tweet to a story that I just posted on stlpublicradio.org. But yeah, it's very different than what it was. I still have press people who say, "What's your deadline?" And it's like, "I'm writing this now," and it'll be going up in maybe an hour, maybe less.
Yeah, it's not that it's a good or bad thing. It's just different.
How does that affect what you're doing now?
Yeah, a lot of time it gives public officials more sort of instruments in their messaging tool chest. But it also makes you have to have a very concise message, and you have to feed the beast quite a bit. So it's a very different way of communicating with the press and with the public.
Yeah, and I was going to just ask him kind of to elaborate on that. I would be hard-pressed for me to knock Twitter or social media because I'm on it so much. I'd be a giant hypocrite. But I have heard the rumblings that the reliance on that, especially in political journalism, both federally and Missouri, maybe has made the discussion and discourse less substantive. Do you think that's a possibility, or what do you think about that?
I think just because of the medium, it forces journalists and it forces sort of press people and campaign people to focus a little more, probably too much, on the actual horse race instead of the issue at hand. And that's just because of the constraints you have on time. It's the constraints you have on length. I still like to read good old-fashioned papers in the morning. I like to read about things, the issues I don't know about. A lot of times, social media, you tend to focus your attention on sort of what is the reaction to the story of the day, or what's the horse race matchup. And I think that's something that, while it's good and it's instant, it does change the focus of sort of state government and campaign reporting.
So then you did. After I skipped over the part that Jason, was right. After you left the governor's office, then you went to private. correct? And wasn't that kind of, wasn't it several Democratic consultants who went there? Or explain all that.
Yeah, so I joined a consulting firm along with Ken Morley, who was the governor's 2008 campaign manager, and several others. And since then on, a couple years later, we then left that Washington, D.C. based firm and started our own firm, Tightline Strategies. Okay. We now are located across the country, from D.C. Out to California. But I get luckily focus most of my attention and energy here in Missouri.
So you're still based in Missouri?
I live here, as opposed to a lot of the business partners I have or people in political consulting. I mostly stay within Missouri. I have enough clients in Missouri. I get to do stuff here. And what it leads to is I for the most part, get to sleep in my own bed each night.
How about that?
Important.
Well, give us a sense of who some of your clients are without promoting any. I mean, just so we can show how things kind of change.
Well, sure. So we have, we've candidate clients. We did Governor Nixon's reelect, obviously. We did Jason Kander's Secretary of State race when he became the youngest statewide official in America. And then we do a lot of ballot initiative work. I mean, back in 2012, we ran the opposition to changes to the Missouri Court Plan. Missouri Nonpartisan Court Plan is a big deal, not only in Missouri, but in over 30 states.
Yeah, that was a really tough one considering the proponent side gave up before they started. So.
Well, there's a reason they gave up. It was a flawed idea, and we ended up defeating that 76-24, one of the largest defeats of a constitutional amendment in the history of Missouri.
Yeah, and that was kind of unusual. So now, who are some of your clients this cycle?
Sure. So right now in Missouri, we are running the transportation tax proposal here. That was a really big thing that came out of the legislative cycle. The knock on Jeff City is that that big issues don't get tackled and that there's too much partisanship. And I think that was an issue where 105 reps voted for that, 22 senators.
Yeah, and I have to say that was to going the legislative route again after it got filibustered in 2013. I was surprised that was the avenue this time. I think on this show I called it like putting all the eggs in one basket with a giant hole in it. So I didn't think it was going to pass that way because of the filibuster. But by doing that, it's on the ballot. You don't have to spend the money to gather signatures, and you can kind of conserve your resources and energy for what I think will be a tough campaign over the next few months.
Were you surprised that it was put on the August ballot as opposed to November?
We were a little surprised, but I do think it helps us sort of continue that momentum we had out of the legislative session. This is such an unusual issue just because transportation is such a core governmental service, and it's something that both Republicans and Democrats support. It's something that, frankly, business and labor support, which we don't see a lot of here in Missouri, and it's something that while urban, suburban, and rural Missouri have different transportation needs, they all sort of coalesce around wanting to do something on transportation. So it'll make for a fascinating campaign.
Now, much has been made about Nixon coming out in opposition to it, but I have another more public policy related question. By putting it in August and by rapidly constricting the time to put the project list together, has he potentially put forward a scenario where the project list may not be as well thought out of if it ends up passing, and maybe having those extra months may have allowed for a better transportation policy for the state?
Well, I think, look, MoDOT and stakeholders across the country have been preparing for this for years. I mean, they've had Blue Ribbon commissions and other things. We know what the transportation needs are here in Missouri. And really, the thing is they're locally based. I mean, the needs that we have in the city of St. Louis, you're looking at them doing a lot of transit and some other stuff for the first time, because right now, the gas tax prohibited from going to anything but roads and bridges. Their needs there are much different than the needs in rural Missouri. So people know what the needs are, basically. It is a challenge to get that project list finalized and have the type of public input, but everybody knows what sort of the major needs
are. There other now? One thing I want to make clear: the governor is against the tax, just so people know, which makes it intriguing. But second, are there other clients that you have this cycle this year?
So that's the big one on the ballot. Obviously, here in Missouri, it's a really unusual circumstance. For the first time in more than 20 years, we don't have a presidential race, a gubernatorial race, or a U.S. Senate race on the ballot.
And we have a state auditor with no Republican state auditor with no Democratic rival.
It is just a very odd election cycle.
Why do you think
this
that
should
was?
happen every 12 years, just by the nature of the terms. This should happen. We of course didn't have that 12 years ago in '02 because you had a special election for the U.S. Senate race.
because
So it really has been a long time since we've had this scenario.
1994.
And that is going to lead to a smaller size election come August, but it's certainly not because transportation has sort of this wide support, it won't hurt our cause.
Were you obviously much has been made about Schweik not having an opponent, but as a veteran of the 2006 election cycle and having covered the West Schumeyer Bob Bainan race extensively, I was more surprised that Brian Munzlinger didn't get an opponent, Bob Dixon didn't get an opponent, Dan Brown, who defeated an incumbent, didn't get an opponent. A lot of these people who had defeated incumbents or faced tough races, or districts that faced tough races, unopposed this cycle. What do you think that says about how Missouri politics has changed? And do you think the Democrats might have missed an opportunity by challenging those incumbent senators and maybe
because
trying to
all of those men are Republicans.
Gain some ground back, basically.
Yeah, look, I think one of the things the Democrats, and the Democratic Party's in great hands. Obviously, Roy Temple, really one of the smartest guys that I've ever been around. Missouri politics, has a wealth of knowledge. I mean, I think they focused pretty narrowly on seats that they really want to take back. They've done a good job recruiting those specific seats, and some of these seats that quite frankly, the numbers for Democrats aren't good there, and it would take a longer shot campaign instead of spreading your resources too thin. I think they've really focused in on a few seats where they think they can make a real difference.
And those seats obviously are the Jill Shoup, whoever the Republican comes out, the John Lamping seat.
24th District, State Senate.
The battle for Jeffco, which I'm surprised that's competitive, because if you go back to 2006, Bill Alter was just blown out by Ryan McKenna that year. Jeffco has changed dramatically, and potentially the Ed Schieffer, Jeannie Riddle seat, but I think that's going to be a tough race for Democrats because it's a Republican-leaning district. But yeah.
What's your take on the climate, how the climate in the state has changed? I mean, especially since you've been, until now, you were a spokesman for one Democrat or another. Is there anything particular that you've noticed that's changed as far as the state political climate?
Well, let's go back to our last general election, which is November of 2012. There were 6 statewide races up. Democrats won 5 of those. This is.
But was that because of the momentum caused by the whole Aiken-McCaskill
and that's
thing?
despite the fact that President Obama lost the state by double digits. What really is at play here, and one of the secrets of Missouri politics, is in non-presidential years, Republicans clearly, in my mind, have a little bit of advantage. In presidential years, it's then incumbent upon Democrats to take advantage of that. But look, the beautiful thing about Missouri is it's a great state to do politics in. Yes, it'd be easier to be a Democrat in New York. It'd be easier to be a Republican in Utah. But Missouri is a very closely contested state where, like I said before, not unlike my parents, there are a lot of ticket splitters there. So they really will look at the individual candidates and their individual campaigns, and that's where the job I have now, being a consultant for those type of campaigns, is important. And frankly, it's a lot of fun.
Now, will you guys be involved at all? There may be dueling things on the November ballot about early voting. Do you know if your firm's going to be involved in one or the other?
We're not engaged of that. But that goes to my point earlier about the presidential versus non-presidential. I mean, if you look at early voting, you look at photo ID, clearly the Republicans in the state would like fewer people to show up. They have better luck when fewer people vote. The Democrats have better luck when more people vote. And that's what that photo ID issue is all about, and it's what the early voting issue is all about.
Yeah, let's talk about 2016 for a second, because while 2014 is important, I think the transportation tax issue is incredibly important for the state, whether it wins or loses.
Yeah.
But 2016 is like political, I don't want to say Armageddon, but I'm saying it's a pretty climactic battle for the future of the state, because you have a lot of...
And the future for both parties.
Yes, exactly. You have a lot of offices that are going to be coming open. The governor's office will be open. The treasurer's office will be open. The attorney general's office will almost certainly be open. Sure. And Jason Kinder will be running for re-election. Who knows what Peter Kinder is going to do? Yeah. What do you think the Democratic chances are going to be that year? Because obviously Chris Koster has a lot of solid intangibles. I mean, he's won 2 statewide elections. He's like a fundraising machine, basically. But you look at the rest of the ticket, there's not like an obvious, ticket that materializes for the Democrats, whereas the Republicans seem to have a lot of people in the wings with a lot of money and potential that could fill all the statewide tickets. What do you think the Democrats are going to need to do to kind of supplement Koster as a gubernatorial candidate?
Well, look, I think Democrats stand a great chance in most presidential years. Like I said, 5 of the 6 elections were won by Democrats in 2012. I don't see why the same dynamic won't shape up in 16. In part, obviously Governor Nixon's 2 gubernatorial races were hard fought. I mean, he clearly did a great job in both those races, won by double digits. That helps Democrats up and down the ticket. I think you have a chance with Attorney General Koster to really build on some of those coattails as well. I mean, he's just a really good candidate. He's the type of brand that that voters like to see here in the state, and I think we'll have quality people up and down the ticket. I think there's some real rising stars in our party that'll fill some of those slots.
Can you name a few?
Well, sure. I think whether or not they want to run for statewide office right away or not, you have names like Representative John Wright. You have here in St. Louis City, you have Tashara Jones, others that are just really good at what they do. And when the time's right, I'm sure they'll take a look at races. I'm not sure if that'll be in 16 or not, but the future's bright for Missouri. This gets painted as a red state, but really when you look down at the statewide elections, it's quite different. And that's part of there's a map in Missouri that works for Democratic candidates, but you have to run a smart, effective, and efficient campaign.
Yeah.
What do you foresee yourself doing in 2016 at this point? Or, do you expect to continue in political consulting? And is there difficulty for political consultants of either party with the lack of donation limits and just some of the other things that have changed campaigns in recent years?
No, yes, absolutely. Our firm will continue to be engaged, in kind of statewide races across the country. Do a lot of governor's races. Do some
What
US
do you
Senate
guys
races.
do? And Jeff Rowe, who was our previous guest, Republican, has a direct mail firm and all that. What do you guys do?
Sure. We primarily are on the general consulting side. So we'll run races, but we also do field. We have a field firm. We have a phone firm.
Okay,
we
so
do
you do
make
phone banks.
TV ads as well. So we do all of those, but we like to manage campaigns. That's sort of the what we like to do. And believe me, when you're in the business we're in, there's no better feeling on election night when you get that 50% plus one, and it's a really accomplishment. The other thing I like about political consulting is it's a real meritocracy. This is most candidates who run and lose never get another chance. Their political career is over. So when you look at, and certainly people have come back from losses, but on the average race, most people lose and they're done. And so when they look at who are they going to put to run, who are they going to entrust to run their race or be part of their political team, they want the best. They want people that have good reputations.
So they
and
want
that are known
winners.
I was just going to say, I agree with you in some extent, but there is a record of people losing and coming back to win. The governor is a big example of that. Claire McCaskill is a big example of that. Blaine Luke DeMeyer. And depending on what happens this year, Shane Scholler, the person that you vanquished in the Secretary of State's race, could become Greene County Clerk. And that's a pretty prominent clerkship, so to speak. But you're right. On average, I think you're right.
But is it harder? I think the point you're trying to make, though, is that for consultants, people who are trying to decide what firm they're going to hire, they're going to go with one that's on the side of the winner.
Yeah, and that's the good thing. In a lot of industries across America, it's who you know and your networking and all that stuff. In the political consulting business, people want to hire people that know how to win. Because their livelihood's on the line, their political future's on the line, and I like that factor, and I think it bodes well for firms that like ours that have sort of a proven track record.
Now, are there certain things that you must do to win? Most people think. Well, I think that while people decry negative ads, they work. So that's why there's certain points, certain key things that you tell a client, look, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this.
And obviously my background and the things I focus on in campaign is message, right?
Okay.
How do you develop a message that works? And then how do you implement a message? And a lot of consultants will essentially tell you, and I think it's a misconception, that you should raise as much money as you can and throw it all on TV, and that's what's going to determine whether you win or lose. And while that is important, take a look at the last two governor's races. Jay Nixon was supposed to run against Matt Blunt in 2008. Jay Nixon was supposed to run against Peter Kinnard in 2012. Well, they never actually even made it to that process because they had a flawed message and they were a flawed messenger, whereas Jay Nixon clearly had a winning message. And I think that's one of the things that we focus on is do you have a message? Can you deliver that message?
And one last question before we're kicked out of the studio. What do you think happens to Jay Nixon in 2016? I mean, we've talked a lot about other people, but I mean, you're right. He has won 2 governorships by wide margins. He's been bandied about as a VP or even a dark horse presidential candidate if Hillary doesn't run. And there's obviously, he could take a third crack at the U.S. Senate possibly. What do you think he'll be doing on 2016?
That's a really great question. I think he'll leave office with extremely high approval ratings. I think him and Kip Bond are really the 2 politicians I know that have a real brand in the state. Then there's certainly other well-qualified, very popular politicians, but I think that the governor will have options open. I think he's clearly I think he's more interested in the executive branch.
Yeah,
than
so
the
he's hoping to get
legislative
an
branch.
appointment.
So maybe a cabinet official or something like that. But again, I don't know. Other than that, if he continues to show great leadership like he has, he continues to be very popular in a Midwestern swing state. That I think he'll have a lot of options come
on the
2016.
VP list.
So, you'll just have to see. I think that his focus every day, and he'll tell you, is sort of running the state and continuing to make progress. But I think that if you leave governor of Missouri popular, if you leave with a legacy behind, you'll have doors will open. I don't know what those are.
Hey, I mean, if nothing else happens to him, he was attorney general 4 times and governor twice and a state senator. That's pretty darn good in my book.
And maybe someday he will agree to come on, politically speaking.
We're calling you out, Governor. Thank you very much for joining with us in studio. For all of our stories, you can follow us at stlpublicradio.org. You can follow me on Twitter at @JRosenbaum. You can follow Joe at
J Mannies. That's JMANNIES.
And you can follow the very well-connected Jack Cardetti at
Jack Cardetti.
Amazing. We'll be back next week. Until then, so long.